Yeah.
Thank you, Amit.
Good afternoon, everyone. Based on your time zone, welcome in Salesforce Apex Hour. And today we are going to talk about OmniStudio. And we have a special guest, Peter, with us. He's the VP of the product in Salesforce industry. So let me hand over to Peter for his introduction and the presentation. Peter, hand over to you.
Thank you, Amit. It's great to be here today. It's early for a Saturday morning out here in the West Coast, but I'm excited to tell more people about OmniStudio. I joined Salesforce when Vlocity was acquired. The deal was announced about a year ago and became official last June. In case there's anyone on the call who's not familiar with Vlocity, we were founded about 6 years ago to build vertical products on top of the Salesforce platform. Our primary industries have been communications, media, energy, health, and insurance. And as we dug into that task, it became clear that as powerful as the Salesforce platform is, it lacks some of the things that we needed. And hence, OmniStudio was born. OmniStudio used to be known as the Vlocity Digital Interaction Platform. You might still see it referred to as that in some places. We've rebranded it now that we're part of the Ohana. But if you see either one of those, either OmniStudio or the Digital Interaction Platform, the Vlocity Digital Interaction Platform, you know now that they are in fact the same thing. So there are 5 sections to the material that I'm going to share with you today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on why we built OmniStudio. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the key components. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about some similarities and differences with other parts of Salesforce, and then give you some information about how we are moving into the Ohana, moving into the rest of Salesforce. And I'm going to show you a quick demo as well. At a high level, OmniStudio is really a digital engagement suite. It is a set of configurable UI components and configurable data services that supports pulling information from either Salesforce or an external system, presenting it to the user interface, allowing users to complete guided tasks that may be spanning multiple different systems or may just be in Salesforce, either one, and basically completing, whether it's a simple task or whether it's a straight through processing type transaction, completing those quickly and easily, regardless of whether it's a self-service use case inside of a community or whether it's an employee-facing use case, let's say in a contact center. So in a nutshell, that's really what OmniStudio is all about. So there are probably a dozen different slides floating around Salesforce describing how the world has changed in the last 12 months. The accelerated push towards digital channels certainly has increased demand for tools like OmniStudio. However, COVID isn't the only game in town. Even before COVID hit, we were seeing trends like the last 2 that I circled here. The first of these is about moving faster. And when we're talking to customers, the need for speed typically comes up, of course, when we're talking about implementation times. It also comes up when we're talking to companies about how quickly they have to respond to new products and promotions introduced by their competitors. Second item is about how customers identify themselves to consumers. So pop-up brands have become common in lots of places. You find them in consumer goods, you might find them in the grocery stores. They're even appearing in what was once thought of as big, slow industries like telecommunications. So for example, Cricket Wireless is actually owned by AT&T. Visible is another small brand in the mobile space that's owned by Verizon. And one of our communications customers has even floated the idea of creating separate brands for AARP members, Harley-Davidson riders, families that like Disney, et cetera, et cetera. They're not quite there yet, but we've seen this happen before with products like affinity credit cards, and this trend looks like it's moving into more industries, which in turn affects how they want to build and maintain their digital channel. And we expect these trends will continue after COVID finally does recede. So trends like these, along with the digital upstarts, are putting pressure on incumbent industry players to keep up. And as consumers, we can appreciate that we do a lot of things online and with our phones that we didn't, say, 5 years ago. So we can order our coffee with our phone and we can pick it up. We can check into a flight online and check the status and use our QR code on the phone as our boarding pass. We can pay our taxes online through a guided interface. We can buy detergent with the button that's on the washing machine. And we can order takeout from any place, anytime, anywhere. After using these types of digital interfaces, consumers start to expect the same level of convenience from all of their service providers. And this phenomenon is called liquid expectations. If Starbucks can have my iced soy latte with a puff of caramel waiting for me after I press a few buttons on my phone, and TurboTax eliminates most of the manual data entry when I fill out my taxes, why do I still need to mail in paperwork for an insurance claim and wait 6 weeks for a check? The reality is, for a lot of the big companies that we serve, it's hard to do this. I mean, some of the companies that have been successful in the examples that I just showed, they make it look easy, but it's not easy. And part of the reason why is because in these industries, there are a lot of complicated rules and a lot of usability obstacles. You know, it's a lot more complicated to provision a telecom switch than it is to make a latte. And a lot of these big companies, they've invested a lot into different channel-specific technologies. It's hard to keep all of those different channels in sync. You know, if you're changing your products or your promotions or something about your business rules and your website, you want that to be reflected at the same time as somebody talks to somebody in your contact center. So there's an efficiency factor of wanting to be able to support both of those simultaneously, but there's also just a consistency, you know, from a business and a policy standpoint as well. And of course, all of these big companies have all these different systems. It's a fact of life, and you've got to work with them. They've got all of these constantly evolving products and promotions, whether they're taking the initiative or their competitors are. You know, a lot of these markets are very much in flux. And in the B2C space, there are a lot of very volatile and spiky volume trends. And probably the poster child for this would be in our media vertical. Our media vertical is focused on, you know, cable companies, companies that are providing entertainment services. And in the pay-per-view example is one that comes to mind. So right before a big sporting event, you'll see this huge spike in volume. People who, you know, jump on, the beer is cold, the pretzels are hot, and, you know, they want to sign up for the pay-per-view. And if the cable company can't handle that huge spike in volume, then it's lost revenue. And you see this in other industries too, where they're serving the public. So for example, one of our customers is Pacific Gas and Electric, with the utility company out here in California. And when rolling blackouts happened, you know, last summer, everybody was logging on and trying to figure out what that meant for them. So if your system was designed for, you know, B2B lead management and it wasn't designed for this B2C case, then that's a problem. So we built OmniStudio to solve those problems and help our customers solve those problems. And we built it on three specific principles. We built it on a digital first principle. And practically speaking, what that means is that we are focused on guided processes that make it easy for the user to do what they need to do without worrying about the technology under the covers. We focused on making sure that all of our UI components worked across the different channels, because companies didn't want to re-implement across channels and because they needed to keep them in sync. And because this digital channel is becoming increasingly important, we've really focused on supporting pixel precise branding and making sure that we work well in that self-service context. We've also designed our componentry to be agile in a couple of important ways. First and foremost, we're big fans of this click-based configuration, and we really look to extend that so that it's not just click configuration in a skin deep level, but even when we get into things like data transformations, we can do some really great, rich data transformations without writing any code at all. Our UI components are all click configurable. So that drag and drop aspect of the tooling is part of what makes us agile. We're also microservices oriented. So one kind of conceptual point of departure between OmniStudio and some of the other parts of Salesforce is that Salesforce has created very rich object metadata and has been extremely effective at leveraging it. You define your objects, and to a large extent, you almost get a UI for free based on your object metadata, which is brilliant. But it doesn't necessarily translate well into some of the business processes that we support. So OmniStudio can consume data, comes from those objects, but it can also consume data that comes from an API, and maybe many different APIs. And so if a customer decides that at some point in time, they're going to replace one of their legacy systems, maybe with Salesforce, maybe with something else, they can plug in a new API in place of the old one. We can do some data transformation if they're not exactly the same. You can plug it into an OmniScript or one of our other process components, and you don't have to reimagine the entire process. You just plug in that new component where it fits. So that's a key concept in supporting this agility element. We've also done a lot of work to make sure that our metadata can be deployed easily through an API. We have got a command line interface, so you can push our metadata from one environment into source control, or from a development environment into a test environment, or test environment into a production environment. Over time, we will do more and more with the Salesforce metadata API, but we have things like product catalog, for example, which is in this kind of gray zone of, it's sort of metadata in the sense that you tend to want to set up your product catalog in a test environment, not in production. And then you want to deploy it, of course, from test or from your sandbox into production when it's ready. Supporting that kind of data that's sort of, it's kind of sort of metadata, but it's sort of reference data, is part of what we do with our continuous deployment capabilities. And we'll continue to use our APIs for that, even after we've adopted more of the SFDX metadata interfaces that Salesforce has. And last but not least, I mentioned this case of the spiky volume. We've done a lot of work to enable our own caching extensions, and we've done a lot of work to build optimization tools to help people understand what parts of a transaction can be performed asynchronously, what parts of a transaction, a complex transaction, maybe the long pole in the tent that requires some additional attention, so that people can get really great performance from our tools. And as part of our roadmap, as we get, we started out today, we're in a managed package, we're actually moving into Salesforce Core. And part of the reason why is because we will get some really great performance benefits as we do that. So we'll continue to really combine some of the work that we've done already with some of the new capabilities we'll get now that we're officially part of Salesforce. So some of you may have seen the Dreamforce keynotes on Einstein Automate. Einstein Automate is a solution based on multiple Salesforce automation and integration tools. It includes existing tools such as Flow, Mulesoft, and Bots. It also includes a couple of new products. You can see these down at the bottom. Flow Orchestrator automates long-running workflows such as approval processes. Mulesoft Composer makes it easy for citizen developers to create simple integrations for their own use or their department's use. And last but not least, we have OmniStudio, which supports digital engagement. Today, these are all separate tools. Over time, you'll see them become more and more harmonized. To me, Einstein Automate is sort of a mini quinceañera party for OmniStudio. It shows that we've arrived and we're stepping up to a bigger role within the Salesforce family. All right, let's talk about key components. So this is called the walk the clock slide. I'm sure everybody's seen many versions of this within Salesforce decks. This highlights many of the key components that make up OmniStudio. It doesn't include every last element, but it includes some of the major ones that I'm going to talk about today. So we have the interaction console, which is a collection of objects and UI components and a couple data services that are designed to support a contact center flow. We've got cards, which are really one of the kind of the core building blocks of OmniStudio. Cards are configurable UI components. Typically, they're the beginning and the ending point for a guided interaction, but they're extremely configurable. They basically give you a way to summarize information from virtually any source. Oftentimes, they're used to launch an OmniScript. OmniScripts they're a wizard-like interface, somewhat similar to Salesforce Flow, but a little bit more advanced in some respects as it relates particularly to like the consumer and partner-facing channels. Omni Analytics is a collection of capabilities really for instrumenting the UI. So for Omni Analytics is used to capture clickstream data from OmniScripts and from cards. It also captures data about data related to invoking some of our other APIs and other data services. It's used for measuring digital engagement. Where are you getting traction from users? Where are the users abandoning you? It's also used for doing performance tuning and diagnostics. So it has a lot of applications. There are some features in Omni Analytics that help you visualize the data, but the primary benefit here is that we're capturing the data, and then you can analyze it in a variety of different ways using whatever tools are most useful for you. Integration procedures and DataRaptors are two key configurable data services. Integration procedures are basically a pipeline of steps that can have conditional branching logic and so forth, but they basically are used to, typically they're used to combine multiple APIs into a single interface. They're pulling data from, say, different systems, or they're used to call multiple different Apex classes and combine logic in those classes with user inputs to do things like generate a quote. DataRaptors really have two jobs. One job is to read and write data to Salesforce, and they can handle not only the basic case of a click-based, you could think of them as a click-based way to configure a query. That would be the basic case. They can also handle some pretty sophisticated cases. You can union data together with DataRaptors. You can do complex parent-child extracts as well. And then you can push data back into Salesforce and also handle some of those corner cases. So if you get a complex data JSON, for example, you could put in parent-child data with a single DataRaptor, and it's all click configurable, so you don't have to write any code. DataRaptors are also used for transformation. So if you're pulling data in from, let's say, external APIs, and you want to present that to the UI, a DataRaptor will let you take whatever subset of the payload you're getting from that external API and change the names of the properties in that payload, or change the structure of it, or subset the part of it you care about, and present that to your UI components in the form that your UI components actually expect them, or maybe in the form that your pricing component expects them, if that's the case. So a lot of rich data transformation can be done, again, without writing any code using the DataRaptor. IDX Workbench is really kind of implicitly two things. One of them is a command line interface that can be used with Jenkins or Capado or whatever your CI/CD automation tool of choice is. It also includes a desktop application that makes it easy for an individual developer to grab the set of things that they've been working on in their development environment and check those into source control. You can do a visual diff, and there's also some analytics inside of IDX, the desktop application, IDX Workbench, to let you do some performance diagnostics on your system. So some really great features there. Project Explorer is new. Project Explorer is a way of collecting a series of metadata components, maybe components that support a single business process or module, and grouping them all together and putting a label on them. And you can click around and explore what's inside of each of those, or you could export all of them and with IDX Workbench and put them in source control together, so you can start to manage them as a collection. So that's what Project Explorer is about. All right, let's dive into the specifics. This is a screenshot of an interaction console for our insurance vertical. All of these components that you see here are cards, and I'll talk more about cards shortly. These are all click configurable. The layout, the positioning, the content, all of that stuff is click configurable with cards. But in addition to being a good showcase for what you can do with cards, there are also some other capabilities that are in our interaction console. There are some objects behind this that support tracking conversations with the customer. There are data services for pulling together the customer story. The customer story is a series of touch points that we've had with the caller that's on the phone. It might be previous phone calls that we've had with them. It might be cases. It might be quotes. It might be any other touch point that we've had with this individual. We can pull all that information together in the customer story and present it to the contact center agent so that they have that context as they actually talk to this person. We've got capabilities in here that let the agent, this isn't interactive, so I can't show you, but if the agent were to click on any of these fields or click on any of the actions in this page, we can automatically capture that and reference it in the future as something that happened in this particular call. There's a feature called the interaction launcher, which when a caller comes in, it allows the agent to look up that person's information and verify that they are who they say they are, maybe prompt them for their last 4 digits of their social or whatever makes sense. And only upon verifying that, that person is authorized to access the account information would this particular page show up. So this is actually a page that would show up typically under our interaction object. The interaction object and an interaction record would be the parent record for this page. Alternatively, this can be used with Service Cloud Voice. So if you're using Service Cloud Voice, then the parent record is going to be a voice call, and all of this will fit nicely under that model as well. This is the designer for cards. And so cards have gone through an evolution in the not too distant past. If we were having this conversation, let's say a year ago, I would be showing you a very different screenshot. Cards used to be template driven. Somebody would create a Lightning Web Component template, and the card designer would give you some features for binding fields from an object or fields from a REST API perhaps to the placeholders in that template. You could also do the same with some actions. You could add some actions that provide some contextual things that you can do, maybe with an asset, maybe with an account. Anything that you display in a card might support contextual actions. But that was a year ago. Now we have the next generation of cards, which we call FlexCards, and FlexCards support a true WYSIWYG designer. It doesn't use templates anymore. You can grab data from all of the sources that I've already mentioned, and you can drag and drop the data fields from that source into a canvas. You can resize them, reposition them. You can change the styling. And I'll actually do a demo and show this, but you can really, if a UI developer or a UX designer hands you a mock and says, make it look like this on the page, the FlexCard Designer will let you do that with this WYSIWYG designer. So you can see it's got a style tab and some other things. So we'll dig into this, but it's really powerful. It also provides, you can nest cards inside of other cards and basically treat them as sort of this hierarchy of UI components. With cards as well as OmniScripts, the architectural model that we've created is one in which you're configuring the layout and the content of the user experience. And then when you activate that card or that OmniScript, we will generate a Lightning Web component for it. So one way to think about our UI components, cards and OmniScripts, is that they are Lightning Web component factories. And once you've generated a Lightning Web component from them, you can use that Lightning Web component anywhere that a Lightning Web component can be used. So that certainly includes Flexi pages. It includes community pages. You can even use them. There's even a way to generate them as kind of industry standard web components and to remove the dependency on Salesforce and then use them in like Heroku or use them in Adobe Experience Manager. So it's really a novel concept. I'm not aware of any other ISV that's even attempted this, and we really developed this approach in conjunction with some of our colleagues inside of the Salesforce UI platform team. So it's really a unique, and you won't find it anywhere else in Salesforce at this point either. OmniScript is this guided interaction that hopefully some of you have been exposed to, but it's got some unique characteristics. First and foremost, it supports a very rich layout. You can resize the fields to a much greater extent than you could, let's say, in Salesforce Flow. You can also do a lot of branding. You've got a lot of very visual components that you can add to an OmniScript. Because you're generating a Lightning Web component, it also provides this single page app type experience, whereas the user is interacting with it. A lot of that interaction is localized within the browser. So it's a very smooth experience for the user. So in addition to having a rich interface, it also is a great poster child. It's not the only example, but it's a great poster child for being this microservices client. It can pull data in from wherever. It works across different channels. And because of that Omni Analytics capability I was talking about before, it's got a sort of a built-in feedback loop. So when people start using their OmniScripts or their cards, there's a way to see what users are being exposed to and what they're actually clicking on. If they're abandoning their process, at step 3, then you can dig in and find out, what that funnel looks like and use that as a tool to continuously improve the user experience. This is a not very well disguised example from Verizon, but it's a good example of what customers can do from a styling standpoint with our OmniScripts. OmniScripts are often used in e-commerce types scenarios to support a configure price quote guided flow. They can be used for lots of other reasons, lots of other purposes as well. They might be used, for example, for somebody to file a claim in an insurance case. They might be used for doing a needs assessment in a financial services context. But in addition to being able to support a lot of these different functionally diverse use cases, they are designed to support this pixel precise branding. And one way that they do that is through this capability that we call the Newport design system. So our UI components support the Salesforce design system. Alternatively, they can be rendered with this Newport design system. And Newport is really a collection of style sheet assets that are open source. Any Vlocity customer can just download them off of GitHub and open them up inside of Storybook, and then start to change the styles to be whatever they want them to be. To reflect the fonts and the colors and the logos and the other things that are necessary for a customer facing interface. So it's an extremely externally facing friendly type model. There are a lot of document management capabilities that are built into OmniScript. So you can create documents from templates. You can create PDF documents as well. You can integrate with DocuSign and do e-signatures. That's sort of the first class action that you can add to an OmniScript. And you can imagine that this is important for a lot of these CPQ, customer-facing use cases, because after you've gone through the process of getting a quote or maybe accepting a quote and agreeing to it, having that document leave behind could be very important. So something that we've built in as sort of a first-class citizen of this. A few other key characteristics of OmniScripts is that they support asynchronous actions. Actually, there's a really cool feature that we've added about a year ago that's called the action block. So we can execute, if you, from a drag and drop standpoint, you drag and drop sort of a container into your OmniScript, and then you can drag other actions inside of it. And we can execute those actions asynchronously, and yet wait for all of them to complete before you go on to the next step. So if you need to pull in data from, let's say, 3 different external APIs, you can fire off the request of all 3 of those different sources at once. And this will wait for all of them to come back before it lets the user go on to the next step. So it's a really powerful capability. And we've done a lot of asynchronous things on the server side as well. But sometimes these are really key to being able to get a great user experience when you're doing a lot of complex things in the background. There are navigation features inside of OmniScript that give you control as an administrator over whether the user is going to go back to where they started, which may make sense in some cases, or if they're going to go to some new destination. So if you create, for example, a quote or you create a case, then you might want to take the user to the record you've just created when you're done. So it depends on the context, of course, but the navigation capabilities give you a lot of flexibility about how that gets handled. There's some great features where cards and OmniScripts can refresh each other. So if you're looking at the customer profile and you launch an OmniScript to update their address, when you're done, you want to refresh the card that displayed the address. And you can do all of that through eventing and click configuration. You don't have to write any code to do that. You can send emails, you can do things like save for later. You can even have situations where a customer starts an OmniScript, they get stuck and they call a contact center agent. And the contact center agent can actually pick up the customer's saved in progress transaction and pick up where they left off. This is a screenshot of the new OmniScript Designer. This is about a year old. About a year ago, we introduced this. But as you can see from the screenshot, it's a what you see is what you get editor. This lets you drag and drop elements into the canvas, but it also lets you resize them, and you can edit the properties on the right-hand side in the property panel. There are a lot of great features here. I'm going to show this later when I do a demo. I've mentioned this concept of continuous feedback, and oftentimes that takes the shape of some kind of a funnel that shows how far somebody got through a particular task and where they're getting stuck. We can also do a lot of great analysis around the performance of not only the individual UI steps that a user might be performing, but we can decompose that into what's going on in the background that's driving that performance as well. So the questions that are answered by Omni Analytics roughly fall into these 3 groups. Some of them are related to digital engagement, what drives conversion and abandonment, what do people see and not click on, as well as what did they see and click on. We can see, we can basically contextualize KPIs, whether that's lead creation or sales or whatever it is. We can contextualize those KPIs with the user experience that influenced the KPI value itself. We can also capture lots of information about which channels users are interacting from, and we can pull a lot of things from the user agent string of the browser and put that into a more structured format where it's easy to report on. Omni Analytics is also used for performance tuning and error diagnostics, and we've got some great visualizations of our API calls that are going on in the background. You can see those in like a waterfall chart. You can see where problems are happening. If in fact there is a problem, you could also see lots of stats. And so I'll show you some screenshots of what that looks like. We also have customers that are using Omni Analytics for monitoring purposes. So in some cases, this is an augmentation of Salesforce Shield, where we recommend people use Salesforce Shield, but if they need to contextualize, who's looking at what information through specific APIs, they can, in many cases, get that through Omni Analytics, where Shield doesn't necessarily go into that level of detail. This is a screenshot of one of the built-in charts that we generate. If you turn on omnichannel analytics and you want to track an OmniScript, all you really have to do is select the OmniScript, and we will automatically start to gather the data and generate this type of chart for you. It's also possible to integrate with Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics, and we spent a lot of time in the last release implementing the plumbing for this in such a way that it doesn't require any code. So we've introduced some new metadata components that allow you to describe where do I want to send this clickstream data, which Adobe or which Google URL do I want to send it to, and then which types of events do I want to instrument. You can even use a simple JSON editor to say, this is the payload that I want to send to Google or Adobe. And I guess the context around this is that since all of our UI components, are in a Lightning Web component, they have a shadow DOM. So they're normally like a black box. So you need a way to pipe out what's going on inside of that Lightning Web component. And that's part of what we're doing here. In addition to that, since it's a single page web app, it's not, normally Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics, they're looking for URL changes, but with a single page web app, it's not the URL that's changing. We're changing the data inside of the component, even though the URL is staying the same. So in that single page model, we've basically provided a menu of different types of events that can initiate sending data to one of these external web tracking services. And then we give you the way to say, when this event fires, or when this type of event fires, these are the variables that I want to send, and this is how I want to name those variables so that Google, for example, will recognize them. So this is a standard Google Analytics e-commerce dashboard on the left. This is another, this is created with Google's Data Studio, which lets you create your own widgets and dashboards, but you can pull in data that's in Google Analytics to do it. All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the data services. So DataRaptor, I provided the elevator pitch for DataRaptors. They really do two things. I'm probably not doing them justice to summarize it so much, but they read and write to and from S objects. Those can be very simple transactions, one object at a time. It's kind of the simple case. It can also be very complex interactions as well. It can be, I can read from many different objects. I can execute joins. I can union multiple records together. I can do parent-child data extracts, all without writing any code. I can also reverse that and think about updating those objects. And again, there's the simple case where you're just trying to go in and upsert a record. There are other more complicated cases where you've got parent-child data that you need to insert, and you need to insert in a particular order, and DataRaptor is smart enough to know how to do that. So it's pretty powerful. DataRaptors also do transformations. They do transformations probably in for most of it. It's typically JSON, but they also can do XML transformations as well. And you can change the structure of the nodes, and you can rename things, and you can do formulas that either do row level computations. They can do string numeric and date and other computations at a row level, or they can do aggregates if you have a collection of records and you want to do a sum or an average or whatever. You can also do that with the formula builder inside of DataRaptor. So they're super powerful. They've got, there's an editor for this that makes it easy to simulate. There's caching support. It's really pretty amazing what you can do. These are some of the, this is just a summary, I guess, of some of the use cases that we typically solve for. DataRaptors often are used by OmniScripts and cards. OmniScripts and cards can pull data from lots of places, but DataRaptor is sort of a workhorse that they lean on for a lot of examples. This is sort of a graphic, I guess, representation of this concept of transformation. And we can do upserts, and you can specify which key do I want to match on, for example, when I do a DataRaptor. Integration procedures are really a pipeline of operations. They are a kind of workflow. They are not a long-running workflow. It's a set of steps that get executed in a single transaction, and they're used, like I think I mentioned before, their primary cases are you're combining data from 2 or more APIs, or you're doing some sort of multi-step operation, which are pretty common in these configure price quote use cases. But they've got a lot of options for running steps synchronously or asynchronously. They've got error handling. You can drag and drop a container that says everything that's executed within this container is going to have a try catch associated with it if you want to manage the errors that come from it. You can version and simulate these things. You can also leverage this Omni Analytics capability to understand who's executing them, how long each of the individual steps are taking, and so forth. So again, a summary of some of the capabilities or some of the use cases. Merging different outputs from multiple APIs is a common one. The quote generation one is common. They include a lot of features for caching. You can cache if you know that multiple different users are going to be using the same reference data. Maybe it's product data. That's a common one. If you know that multiple different users are going to use the same output, then you can cache that output and not have to compute it every time somebody accesses it. This is a summary of the time and effort it takes to configure a common multi-step transaction with and without integration procedures. So in an easy case, it takes on average 120 minutes to configure and test and begin to deploy an integration procedure. Sorry, it takes on average about 30 minutes to configure and test an integration procedure, whereas if you were to try to do the same thing with Apex, it'd take about 2 hours. In a complex case, you can see that the difference is quite pronounced. It would take 42 days to get a complex piece of Apex to work, whereas it takes about a day to get an integration procedure to work. And this is based on, actually this came from a Salesforce program architect in Europe, but the types of use cases we're looking at here are really pretty hardcore real world scenarios. And so all of this has been very much battle tested, but it's pretty impressive the level of efficiency that you can gain from this. And we've abstracted basically all of the common things that somebody would have to do the hard way with code, and we've bubbled that up to a click-based interface that's a lot easier with integration procedures. So if you were to compare and contrast an integration procedure to, let's say, Mulesoft, you would see that they have a lot of things in common. They both can do data transformations. They both do multi-step operations. You can talk to APIs, do things asynchronously in bulk, and so on. The big difference between the two is that OmniStudio is much more click configurable. It's within Salesforce. It's really optimized for a lot of Salesforce data and services, but it also works really well for REST APIs, which is kind of the common area. Mulesoft is more of an SDK-based tool. It's deployed outside. It does have some features that integration procedures don't. So if you want to do polling, for example, Mulesoft would be a good way to do that. You wouldn't do that with OmniStudio. If you want to have persistent queues, and if you want to manage like a library of APIs, Mulesoft is really designed for that purpose. It's much more of an industry integration backbone, whereas OmniStudio is designed to be more of a client of some of those APIs. I will say, however, that if you create an integration procedure or you create a DataRaptor, you automatically get a REST endpoint on top of that. You don't have to do any additional configuration. You've configured it, and you can call it, if you want to create your own UI someplace, you can call it just through that REST endpoint. So it's very powerful in that regard. This is a screenshot of Project Explorer. Project Explorer is really, there's two pieces to it. One is inside of the managed package, there's this object called a project. Project can have a many-to-many relationship with lots of different kinds of both Vlocity and Salesforce metadata. And the second part of this is a Chrome extension, which gives you a UI on top of it. So this Chrome extension lets you search. If I did a search here, I'd be searching across all of the different types of metadata that we support. And you can quickly find anything that has like a keyword that you care about, regardless of what component type it is. And then you can create a project that collects a series of these and keeps them together. As you know, maybe it's a set of things that you worked on in a given release, or maybe it's a particular process that has pages, and maybe it has Einstein next best action recommendations, and it's got other things in it that all need to be kept together, and you can do that with this project. IDX Workbench, this is probably too small of a screenshot to do it justice, but it is it's really two things. There's a command line interface that lets you move our metadata around with whatever your chosen tool is. And then this desktop application makes it easy for a developer who doesn't necessarily want to try to do it through the command line interface. Makes it easy for a developer to export a bunch of things that they've been working on and push them into a downstream org, or push them into source control system. It uses OAuth to connect to those. You can also compare these. So you can see that a little bit with this screenshot, that you get this visual comparison of what's different between the version that's in this org versus, let's say, the version that's in source control. And there are a couple other features that we've added to this. This feature, Process Profiler, is using Omni Analytics to create this waterfall representation of how long each step in an integration procedure takes, or how long each step in an OmniScript takes. And then when you click on those steps, you can get some additional details. I think there's another slide in here on that. The test console is another feature that's in this IDX Workbench, and its purpose is to allow you to do unit tests on our declarative components, integration procedures in particular. Here's the screenshot of the process profiler. So, this could be an integration procedure with a whole bunch of different actions inside of it. Some of those might be, we might be invoking Apex classes, we might be hitting external APIs, we might be calling DataRaptors. We could be doing all kinds of things inside of an integration procedure. And when that integration procedure runs, it's common for the user to be waiting for it. It's that integration procedure is running between step 2 and step 3 of an OmniScript, perhaps. And so if somebody needs to understand, like, why is it taking 10 seconds to come back, they can open up this process profiler and they can see, of these various steps, which one is the long pole in the tent. And then when they click on that inside of this UI, you'd see a dialog window that looks like this. And that dialog window, I know this is probably really small font here, but it's showing me things like the number of CPU milliseconds, the number of DML executions that are happening in that step, the number of SOCL steps, the heap size, the duration that it's taking. And depending on how I configure my custom settings, I can see the request and the response data for each of these individual steps. So this is important can be important from the standpoint of performance tuning, but it can also be really invaluable if you're doing error diagnostics. Maybe as an administrator, when you run this in preview mode, it works great. But when a contact center agent runs it, it's hitting an error, which may be a permission issue. Sometimes you can understand the full context of what's going on if you see not just the step where the error occurred, but you can go back upstream and you can see what led to that error. What was the request and response of the step before or the 2 steps before it. So it's a really powerful way to get an X-ray of what's going on inside of a process. This is also a relatively new feature. We introduced it for our insurance customers and our health customers last summer, and our communications, media, and energy customers last fall. And we've heard some really good feedback about what people are able to do with it. Another new feature is this test procedure. A test procedure is really, it's a kind of an integration procedure, but it's a kind of an integration procedure that is really all about unit testing. It allows you to create some sample data, and a couple different ways you can do that, but set up some sample data, execute some actions. You could call an integration procedure that you want to test. You'd also call Apex and other things. And then after those steps execute, you could include some assertion steps that evaluate whether you got the result that you expected or not. And that result is logged into a special object that says you ran this test. And if it didn't come back with a positive assertion, if it failed, then it will automatically log exactly what failed, so that you can go and you can report on it. You can go and dive into it and understand what happened. But when it's done, all of the changes, all of the destructive changes that it's made to the data in the org are automatically going to be rolled back. So you're going to be starting with a blank slate again. So you can run these test procedures over and over again. You can run them, a developer might run them before they check in their changes in the source control to make sure they don't have any regressions. A QA engineer might run them in a testing environment, might run a whole library of them. So they can be called from a command line interface. They can also be called from the IDX Workbench. Inside of IDX Workbench, I don't know, this is the screenshot that I really wanted, but this isn't the screenshot I wanted, but inside of IDX Workbench, you can invoke these tests under different user profiles. So in many cases, it's not sufficient to know whether a test runs under administrative profile. You might want to run it under 3 or 4 other profiles to make sure that everybody's got the right access level to complete that transaction. And the IDX Workbench has got a nice interface, although it's not really shown here, that lets you pick different people and execute a series of test procedures as those people. It does give you this, this is basically a variation of that process profiler we were looking at. So if there's a problem, if there's an assertion failure, you'll see it flagged in this type of interface, and then you can drill in on the steps and get more details about exactly what unexpected result occurred there. All right, so that's the bulk of what I wanted to get through, and Amit, keep me honest here. I know we're getting close to time. I do want to do a really quick demo at the end. I have just a couple of slides here. And how strict are we on time?
We are flexible, so you can go ahead.
Okay. All right, so just a few things on, I showed you the comparison and contrast with MuleSoft. This is, one question that I get asked a lot is, how is OmniScript similar or different from Salesforce screen flows? And, this has been sort of a Coke and Pepsi conversation at times, but I think I've had a lot of discussions with my colleagues in Salesforce platform about this. And I think we've jointly produced this and agreed upon this as a fair way to characterize the differences. But OmniScript is basically, it's a UI first designer, whereas ScreenFlows are much more of a process first designer. They both do guided interactions. They both have branching logic. They both read and write to Salesforce data. They both can call Apex and custom Lightning Web Components. You can embed them in third-party web pages. They both have debuggers. So they certainly do have some important things in common. I think the capabilities around OmniScript are usable in multiple different contexts, but they are especially valuable in a consumer-facing or partner-facing context, both because they support branding, because they provide that responsive single-page experience, and because they do things like they integrate with Google Analytics and other types of external web analytics tools. That's a feature, a built-in feature that they support. Another interesting thing about OmniScripts is because they are drawing on the capabilities of integration procedures and DataRaptors, they can consume data from external APIs without any code. And typically when you're writing screen flows that are pulling data from external sources, you've got to go into Apex and write code. ScreenFlow has got ambitions to change that over time. So maybe in the future, ScreenFlows will provide more ways that you can do things without code. But for the time being, this is I would say another important difference between the two. ScreenFlows do have some other features which are worth calling out. I think, depending on the use case, they can be simple. I was talking to John Kucera, he's the SVP of platform who oversees screen flows and a bunch of other things. And I told him we're in the middle of a K-shaped recovery where, some people are probably fine in this kind of weird COVID economy that we're in, and other people are really suffering. And to me, that almost seemed like a metaphor for what it's like to configure a screen flow. Like if you're either on the upward side of the K or the downward side of the K, depending on the use case you're trying to support. If you're talking about a simple case where you're reading, writing to Salesforce data, I think screen flows are really easy to use, and they're great at solving that particular problem. If you get into a case where you're having to do any kind of data transformation, then you have to start writing code, or you have to start writing custom LWCs, and then you've fallen off the happy path, and it can become very unhappy shortly in some of those situations. So it just depends on the use case. But they do have some nice looping and branching capabilities. We do branching. We do have ways of doing looping, but I think you'll find more graphic support for this inside of screen flows. They've got a library of third-party components, which in some cases, could be super useful. So that's a short description of the similarities and differences. The simple thing I would say, if you don't remember anything else, remember that the OmniScripts are really more optimized for the partner and the consumer channel. Although if you create them for those channels and you have a valid reason to reuse them, they also do work great for employees. This is sort of another sort of guideline around, if you want to think about the swim lanes for these things, where they belong. In the industry case, you should always be using OmniScript for the consumer and partner personas. For the employee personas, it's really the path of least development, and that's a function of both the use case as well as the whether it makes sense to reuse something that's available for this persona. And in the general case where we're talking about outside of industries, consumer partner support, it would be the path of least development, and for the employee persona, flow would be probably the default that you would use in the absence of some other specific reason. All right, a few slides about moving into the HANA. Vlocity was developed in a couple of key managed packages. And if you deploy Vlocity today, you will be using one of these managed packages. One of them supports health and insurance, and we sometimes call this the HINS package. And the other one supports communications, media, and energy. And if you look at the contents of those packages, you'd see that they have a combination of objects and Apex classes that are specific to these verticals, but they also have the OmniStudio code and the OmniStudio tooling and metadata objects inside of them as well. And so that's true of both of these. That's where we're at today. Let's talk about where we're going. We're moving OmniStudio into Salesforce Core. That's a big project, and it'll really take us, over a year to get it done. It may take us 2 years to get it all the way done. But we're doing it in stages so that folks outside of the Vlocity verticals can start to benefit from this sooner rather than later. And the way that we're doing it is by creating it's a two-pronged attack. We are simultaneously moving some things directly into Salesforce Core. And in parallel, we are moving some of this OmniStudio code into its own package. So it's unencumbered with all this other vertical specific functionality. It's lighter and smaller and more focused. And that's this OmniStudio Foundation package. So its purpose is to support all of these other use cases. Its purpose is to support other verticals. Its purpose is to work outside of Salesforce industries for Sales and Service Cloud customers. And then over time, this package will actually disappear. Like I said, end to end, it may take us over 2 years to get it completely done. We'll do it by degrees, and we'll do it in a way that generally it won't affect the way our customers operate. I mean, they need to know, of course, do they install the package or not, but they won't know that, behind the scenes, some of the code is moving from the package into core. It'll just happen, under the covers. The big benefit for us, there's a couple of benefits. I mean, one goal, of course, is to enable more people to take advantage of OmniStudio. Another goal is really to take advantage of some of the things that we can do inside of Salesforce Core that you can't do in Apex. So when you're inside Salesforce Core, your code is Java, not Apex, and Java for some important operations runs a lot faster. So we get a huge performance and scalability boost as we start to move some of our engines into Core. We're not subject to the governor limits that Apex is subject to, which doesn't mean that there won't be governor limits. So there will be some. I mean, we don't want people to misuse the service, but they won't be the Apex governor limits, and they'll have probably much higher thresholds because they'll just fundamentally perform a lot better. As we do this, we'll also move towards push upgrades, and that won't happen right away. It'll take a couple of releases, but it's something that we have on our roadmap, and probably roughly in a year from now, we'll be doing push upgrades so that people won't have to pull new versions of our packages. So I think that's the end of the slides. Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to do a super elaborate demo for you, but I will flash a few things here. Assuming I can get this moved over into the right window. So this is that interaction console that I showed you briefly during the slides. This is the interaction launcher, and the purpose of the interaction launcher is this utility that looks like that's not the one I wanted. There we go. The purpose of the interaction launcher is to make it easy for a contact center agent to search for a particular customer. Or it might be a customer, it might be some other third party. In the case of insurance, it could be a policyholder, it could be an agent, it could be a beneficiary. Maybe Uncle Joe passed on, and so his niece needs to call up. So it lets me find people. It lets me verify that maybe I get multiple results. In this case, I only got one, but I can confirm that this is the person that I meant to find. And then once I've done that, I can verify that they are who they say they are through one of a variety of different means. So this is a configurable component that supports this identification and verification flow. If I were to click Launch Console, it would create a new top-level interaction record, and it would show me information about that particular individual that the agent is talking to on the phone. There's an alternative, as I mentioned before, there's an alternative variation of this, which works with Service Cloud Voice. So I've been in lots of conversations with my Service Cloud colleagues about how these components fit in that model, and the good news is that they also fit very well there too. So it just depends on whether the customer needs or is interested in Service Cloud Voice. And these are all kind of working examples of these cards. So if I were to click on let's say I wanted to do an auto insurance quote, I can click on this. This actually, maybe before I do that, I'll highlight that these cards are actually driven by Einstein Next Best Action. So all of the content is coming from and is recommended by that tool, but we can control the way that the information is presented inside of the card. I'm not going to go all the way through this auto quote, but this just gives you an idea of what the UI looks like. Typically, I would wire this up in such a way that it would pre-fill all of the data. So if I'm giving a quote to Sophia Fournier, normally I would set this up so that we would automatically pull in her information. Some examples of the interactive nature of the UI here can be seen. Like if I click on these drop downs, I'm actually doing a real-time pull from a REST API, and this REST API, I think it used to be Kelly Blue Book, and now it's some other generic API that's free that I put in here. But this allows me to pull the make and model of different cars. That's not a good example. Let me get I think BMW's got better data. So all of these pick list constraints work. All of this is configurable inside of OmniScript. So I'm not going to finish out this whole thing, but if I wanted to do something like add multiple different records, I can do that. And then as the user is going from step to step, as they go through their OmniScript, we can call whatever services we need in the background, whether it's fetching data or whether it's saving data or whether it's calling services that are doing calculations. We can do all of those things. I have other simple OmniScripts. The quotes tend to be more involved. Some of these are really simple. This one is used, it's a single step, so you don't even see a list of steps. It's just a single step, and it can show up inside of a dialogue. This is kind of an interesting example. I've got this set up so that, let me change this. I've got this set up so that if somebody changes their address, and normally I would have a Google API that would give me type ahead support for this, but my Google API expired, but I'll see if I can wing it anyhow. That'll save that right there. And it actually refreshed this other card. So this card went from homeowners offer, or sorry, it went from, I think, some sort of offer for an art seminar to homeowners offer because the user changed their address. So the premise is that, oh, you moved into a new house, maybe it's time to talk to you about homeowners insurance. I put this in the demo, I guess, for two reasons. One, just to show that the offers here could have some intelligence to them and respond to what the contact center agent is doing as they're talking to the customer, but also to show how updating, executing an OmniScript can trigger this event model, this page level event model, where other cards can listen to it. And so the listeners and the events are all click configurable, but it makes the partial page refresh, much more interactive. All right, let's take a quick peek at the construction of an OmniScript. Let me just kind of take you through the basics here. So when I'm configuring an OmniScript, I've got a series of actions that are available to me. Some of these are performing calculation steps. Some of them may be reading and writing from Salesforce through a DataRaptor. I've got actions for integrating with DocuSign, sending emails. I can call integration procedures, generate PDFs. I can call APIs directly. I've got functions in here for doing different types of formulas and and summaries. I can drag and drop steps in here. So if I wanted to add a new step, I'd basically be putting it in there. Once I've got a step in there, I can start to put in UI elements. So most of these UI elements are inputs. So all of these different inputs are supported. I wanted to put, like, I don't know, let's say we want to put a date in here. I'm dragging and dropping it. I can select it. I can resize it. I go and change the labels over here in the properties. I can also preview this. I'm going to get rid of this because it's going to get in my way. I can preview this. Typically, if we are going to pre-fill a bunch of data, we're going to pass in some contextual information. So I might pass in, this is like an account ID, or it might be an interaction ID. And then as you step through this, you can see the payload of the data that the UI component is managing. So it is a single page concept, and whether you are saving data as you go from step to step is entirely up to you. You might want to do that, but you might have transform data that's being brought up to the UI. You might be saving the results of past server actions, and to the extent that that becomes relevant, you can see all of this information here. This is super useful if you're trying to develop and debug. You can also open up the debugger and see all of the steps and the payload for all of these steps that's moving back and forth as you execute. You can look at this inside of different form factors. So if you want to know what it's going to look like on a tablet or mobile, you can do that as well. We talked about the ability to do pixel precise branding. You can do that with Newport. Excuse me. Newport looks different out of the box, but its primary purpose, frankly, is to give you a set of assets that you can go and style yourself. So there's a process for uploading those styled assets as a static resource, and then you'd start to see the output here. So that's a quick preview of OmniScript in the designer. This is an example of that FlexCard that supports the profile, and you'll see that the designer looks similar to what we were just looking at with OmniScript. This gives you an idea of some of the elements you can put in there. You can put actions in there that are going to be buttons or links or maybe icons. You can group things into blocks for the purposes of keeping them together and having some padding or borders around them. You can put child cards in here. You can have sort of an n level deep set of cards that, in this case, these are going to render these tags that indicate that this individual falls into some marketing segment. But you've got tables and charts and images and other things that you can pull in here. If I look at the data sources behind this, you can see some of the different places where I can grab this data. I can grab it from the SOQL query or social search, an Apex class. I can grab it from a REST API or an integration procedure. And then the data that I grab is actually, let's do a little preview here. This source. Hopefully that account ID is still valid. So the data that's coming back here.
Oh. Click on the JSON.
There we go. Take a second to update. So this is the data that's coming back from this request, and here you can see the field. So, I could pull these in here, or I could put them into like a rich text box. So there's a lot of power there. You can also configure these event listeners. So, oftentimes when you've got this case where you want to refresh a card in response to something that the user is doing in a different card, or that they're doing in an OmniScript, you can create an event listener that will automatically respond to PubSub and other events. So that's a quick preview of cards. They also support this ability to see what they're going to look like in different form factors. Let's take a look at an integration procedure in a DataRaptor. This is the integration procedure that supports that card we were just looking at. And what you might have noticed is I've got the weather coming in from some API. I've also got the local time in addition to information about this particular customer. So the way that works is I've got a DataRaptor that is pulling in information from this customer account. That's sort of step one. Those tags that we saw are being transformed from multi-select pick lists into an array here. Step two, I've got a couple of API calls to get the weather and the local time. And then I've got a step here that's going to basically filter out a bunch of noise from these APIs that I don't care about and just summarize this for the user. So this is the DataRaptor. No, that's not the DataRaptor I wanted. Let me go to this DataRaptor. This DataRaptor is actually it's very simple. It's just pulling data from one particular object. This is the object up here, and I'm feeding it an ID, which is the context of the page, and so it's actually pulling in a bunch of customer information. It's using a join syntax so that it's the customer account for this interaction that I'm actually pulling all of this information that's going to show up in that profile FlexCard. But I can also do other types of formulas. Here I'm combining all of these different address elements into something that's concatenated that normally, that Google would understand, or that I can show as one single concatenated output of my UI. You can do all kinds of formulas here. I mentioned that you can do aggregates, so you can see, things like average, and you can see all these date functions and string functions that are there. You can create your own synthetic attributes based on this. And then there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how you take these inputs and then you represent them as an output JSON structure. And you can do a preview as well. So if I want to know, probably not a valid ID, but if I wanted to know, did I set up my transformations the right way, I can keep iterating here until I know it looks right. So the integration procedure itself, let's see, maybe highlight a couple more things here. These blocks up here let me do things like caching. If I know I'm going to reuse an output, I can basically lasso these things and put them in a cache block. If I want to add some conditionality to a bunch of steps, I can put them in a conditional block. I can loop through a series of records through a loop block. I can do try catch and have a, if there's an error, control the error message that goes back to the user that way. And then this has got its own preview capability as well. So I was just executing it earlier. This shows me what I'm going to get as a result. That's the same thing we saw when we were looking at the card. So it's the same data coming back. And if I were to show you the API calls to the weather and to the local time, you'd see that they're quite verbose. I've just pared those down to a couple of things. What's the temperature? What's the URL for the little icon, the little weather icon, and then what's the local time and the label. So pretty simple. So that's a quick preview, a whirlwind tour, if you will, of some of the OmniStudio tools. And I know that I've probably overstayed my welcome here a little bit by dragging this out as long as I have. So I'll stop there and ask if there are any questions.
Thank you so much. It's a really great, helpful session. So let me allow a participant to unmute themselves and they can ask a question. So I see some question from Don. So Don, you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Sure, Peter, thank you so much. What a great walkthrough of the product. I think you already answered my question. It had to do with the roadmap, and I think you spelled it out pretty effectively. And I'm just excited about when I'd be able to actually plug this into a live work. I'm already working with it as a training instructor. But anything else you want to add to whether or not when this plugs in, is it just going to be available as another tool set, or would it be more along the lines of you'd actually have to pay for it with a price tag? Can you speak to that? And then I'll yield back. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have to safe harbor this a bit because it's forward looking, but my current expectation is that FlexCard, a simplified version of FlexCards that probably is limited to SOCL and SOCL, will be bundled in with the Salesforce platform, and everybody who has access to the Salesforce platform will be able to use it. Now, the exact timing of that is TBD. It may be as far away as a year from now. We're trying to work through the timing details around that, but that is the current thinking. As far as some of the other features that we've looked at, such as OmniScripts, integration procedures, and DataRaptors, they will likely be their own SKU that customers would use. They would be bundled with some of the industry products as they are today. We're in the process now of letting additional industries build their products on top of OmniStudio, and then for customers in Sales and Service Cloud, it would be a separate SKU that they would purchase.
Great, thank you.
Anybody have any other question? Feel free to unmute yourself. So one question I have, Peter, we are working for lots of clients right now in the Vlocity. So you are saying this feature will become as part of the platform. So what about the existing customer who are already developed, their code is developed by a part of package? So how it will be worked out?
Yeah, so for customers that are using our packages today, they will be unaffected. I mean, the commercial terms of their use won't be affected. They'll continue to be valid. They will be beneficiaries of the work that we're doing to move the code to the platform. So again, it's a little early to say exactly what the net effect is, but we think that our DataRaptors, for example, may be 400% faster once we get them into core. We were looking at a pretty sizable leap in terms of performance and scalability, which is really exciting. Our existing customers will be able to benefit from that without touching their package configuration at all. And in order for that to be the case, we are effectively doing a couple things. We're moving code into core, and we will start to change the existing packages such that they will call the code that's in core instead of executing locally within the package. So that means that without doing any work, our customers will start to benefit from this. Eventually, our existing legacy customers will have to move their metadata from the custom objects that pre-existed before we were part of Salesforce into the new equivalent objects that will exist inside of Salesforce. But they don't have to do that anytime soon. They'll get some of the performance benefits before they worry about that. And my hope is that that's a largely automated exercise. At this point, we expect it to be, but we're still doing some research there.
In short, it will be not a configuration changes. It will be data migration kind of activity, which will be change the data object mapping.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's possible that there will be some other configuration changes, but my expectation at this point is that it will be much less of a change than, say, moving to Lightning Web Components was for our Angular customers. You'd be dragging it here.
Yes.
If I did that, my properties window would let me pick the actual Lightning Web component that I wanted to include. And
Right.
typically